Let's start the second class, historical development of contextualizations. From the very beginning, the missionary message of the gospel of Jesus Christ incarnated itself in the life of the world of those who embrace it. Although the early church and the first modern Catholic and Protestant missionaries from the West in the 1700s took other cultures seriously, this mindset of contextualization was lost in the period between 1800s and 1950 in the history of mission. The church was born and grown up in a Jewish culture at Jerusalem. When the Christian message was delivered to the Gentile world, all the Jewish cultural clothes were taken off from the gospel at Jerusalem Council. We can see in Acts 15. And the gospel was contextualized in a new setting of the Gentile culture. The Apostle Paul and Barnabas go to the Gentile world for mission, and they contextualize the message of the gospel in the Greek and Roman culture. For example, in Acts 17, Paul contextualized the gospel of Jesus Christ in the cultural and philosophical views of the Greek. In this way, from the apostolic age, church fathers, Catholic missionaries, and Protestant missionaries throughout the history, they have a great emphasis on contextualizations. They took other cultures seriously and contextualized the gospel in their culture. But this mindset was lost in the period between 1800 and 1950. Why? Let's see. During that period, the church in mission more often than not disregarded culture and saw itself handing out an eternally unchanging gospel which must destroy other culture or non-Western culture. Of course, there was an awareness of the westernizations of the gospel interwoven into the missionary enterprise. And consequently, the gospel has come to be seen in many non-Western countries as a foreign gospel. Therefore, historical reasons, of course, for this disregard of other culture. Firstly, the West was unaware of its ethnocentrism, the attitudes that one's own culture is superior, the center of the universe, while other cultures are inferior and uncivilized. Colonialism expressed these attitudes economically, politically, socially, and too often religiously. It was felt by many that non-Western people needed to be civilized or westernized in order to be Christianized. This mindset of contextualization was lost in the period between 1800 and 1950 in the history of mission. Why? The first reason was due to colonialism. The westernizations or colonialisms was interwoven into the missionary enterprise. When the Westerns colonized the new land, they also introduced the missions, which is designed and formed in the Western culture, and wisdom forms. And the second reasons, the West was unaware of its ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism means the attitude that one's own culture is superior, the center of the universe, while other cultures are inferior and uncivilized. That is the mindset or the attitude that my culture is better than yours, my religion is better than yours. Colonialism expressed these attitudes economically, politically, socially, and too often religiously. It was felt by many people that non-Western people needed to be civilized and westernized in order to be Christianized. Many people felt that non-Western people needed to be civilized or westernized in order to be Christianized. The third reason was the intellectual climate generated by the European Enlightenment. The rise of science, the age of reasons, and the growth of critical history led many people to believe that Western culture had come of age, throwing off the superstitions of the past and of so-called primitive and exotic cultures. Technology, efficiencies, the individuals, and the material world, these were the things that drove and still drive the Western world. But the intellectual, political, and cultural climate has changed dramatically. The Christians' awareness of cultural differences and their respect for different cultures has increased dramatically. Christians now understand theology not as a way of understanding the whole of reality in order to grasp it, but as a reflection on their committed action, understanding reality from their admittedly partial perspective in order to change it. So we can see here three main reasons that the missionary lost their concerns on other cultures, and missionary lost their concerns on contextualizations during the period between 1800s and 1950. These three reasons. Number one is colonialisms. Along with colonialisms, they introduced Christianities and the gospel, which is designed in the Western culture and Western formed. So that is the first reason. And the second reason is the attitudes of ethnocentrisms. Ethnocentrisms means the attitudes that my culture and my religion is superior and yours culture, your religion is inferior. And the last reasons was the intellectual climate generated by the European Enlightenment. In Europeans, in the Western countries, science is advanced, technology is advanced. So many Western people thought that their culture, their technologies, and their way of thinking is more secular and logical. These three reasons are the main reasons that missionaries lacked contextualization during the period of 1800s to 1950. Now we are going to look how contextualization is developed again in the Christian history, in the history of missions. The development of contextualization is revitalized from 1960s when the Church of the Third World countries began to be aware of their responsibilities and launched a movement for theological instruction from their experience. There are two significant periods in the history of contextualizations. The first period occurred in the 18th century and is known as the Enlightenment. This drove the emergence of modern liberal theology. The second period began in the decades immediately following the Second World War. The Second World War, giving rise to contextual theology in the mid of 20th century. These two periods birthed the fruit of theological change. Dr. Hang Puhu gives 4 factors for redeveloping contextual theology from 1960s. First, the development of Christian overseeism affect contextual theology. The development of Christian overseeism affect contextual theology. The message of the gospel was at first spread to Greco-Roman world, and Christianity gradually became Hellenized and Romanized during colonial period. The overseeism of the church and theological understanding of Christianity were inevitably colored by the Western characteristic due to the rise of westernizations and colonizations. However, to establish a church in new context wherein their culture were totally different from Greek or Roman background for itself provided opportunity for developing theology in local context. This is the basic reasons for emerging the contextualizations of mission and theology. Second, changes of international, social, political situation influence contextual theology to be more advanced. After the Second World War, the Third World countries became independent nations with self-determinations. The changes in social politics influenced the Christians to seek a new and relevant church identity in the process of nations building. Third, trends of contemporary philosophical thought impact on the development of contextual theology. The fourth and last factor is change in theological currents themselves. After 1960s, the church have more emphasis on cultures, ethnic peoples, and cultures. So these emphasis and these theological current change help contextualizations to be advanced. Now, continually, we are going to look biblical basics for contextualizations. The biblical texts were written within the context of respective history and cultures. The work of contextualization can be seen throughout the Bible. Actually, the Bible is the book of contextualizations because God is the contextualizers. God is the author of contextualizations. God revealed himself. God made himself to be known by human being. God made himself to be understood by human being. God made his salvations, the act of redemptions, to be known and to be received by human being. So in this sense, we can say God is the author of contextualization. Therefore, the Bible is the book of contextualization. The work of contextualizations can be seen throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, the work of contextualization can be clearly seen in God's self-revelations to the world, Israel liturgical patterns, God's relationship in a world of karmic justice, wisdom literature, and prophetic communications. First of all, let's see contextualizations in the Old Testament. The Old Testament writers deliberately contextualize their materials in according with a changing historical cultural sequence. Glaser mentioned that the OT patterns of worship forms, ethical obligations, and the focus of theology arose out of context. Each successive pattern was a valid expression of the historical realities of the context, teaching Lebens. These sections will deal with the OT contextualizations, particularly God's revelations to the world and the liturgies of Israel, God's relationship in a world of karmic justice, wisdom literature, and in prophetic communications. God's self-revelations in the Old Testament was uniquely linked to the real cultural and historical events. The OT prophets employ a contextual communication in their ministry. They received the word of God and communicated it to people orally, in its symbolic forms, and in actions and in writing. They deliver their prophetic message through utilizing symbols, symbols, metaphors, and pictorial images. They often used dramas, sayings, proverbs, and poems. The figures of speech was taken from the life of the real people. Hosea incarnated God's message in his life by marrying a harlot to show God's pain and love for Israel. By his symbolic actions and message, the people of Israel learned that their worship of Baal deserved God's wrath. Prophet Amos contextualized his message in appropriate ways of speech forms. Jeremiah spoke of God's faithfulness and pointed with a convictions to the certainty of God's ultimate triumphs in history. Ezekiel had a vivid demonstrations of sensitivity to the context in which his hearers found themselves. Therefore, contextualization had a prophetic role in Israel society. So in brief, we can notice that the people of Israel adapted the local times and contextualized into a new meaning in the light of divine spiritual law. This inspires us to adapt the local culture and contextualize into the new meaning in the principles of the gospel message. However, we also can notice that Israelites separated themselves from the ancient culture, Near East people, separated themselves from the ancient Near East people in terms of religious practice and worshipping one God. It echoes Paul's methods at Athens city. Though Paul adapted the Greek philosophy, poems, and proverbs to convey his message to the people of Athens, but he spoke against the Greek idea when he preached about the resurrections of Jesus. This fact inspires us not to dilute or not to distort the message of the gospel when doing contextualizations. Contextualizations in the New Testament. Contextualization in the New Testament. The New Testament mission is the history of contextualizations. The life of Jesus was recorded by 4 Gospels writers, writing to different people with different contexts. So the Gospel writers contextualize their message, the message of the Gospel in the context of their audience. Luke's presentations of Jesus seems broad enough to address the poor and the rich, the elite and the marginalized, the educated and the uneducated. However, Luke has special emphasis on the marginalized, the outcasts, and Luke contextualized well the story about Jesus in the social cultural context of the Greco-Roman audience. The Apostle John adapted the Greek terms logos, idea, and contextualized into a Jewish understanding of God, then reveals God's incarnation through the Son Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Jesus himself is the model in doing contextual missions. The incarnation of Jesus served a key paradigms for doing contextual theology in missions. Jesus himself is the model in doing contextual missions. The incarnation of Jesus serves a key paradigms for doing contextual theology and mission. He was born under the law, took a human forms, and adapted Jewish culture and traditions, and then revealed the nature of the invisible God. Jesus is our mothers. If we look the book of Acts, the Christian church was born and began in a Jewish culture and grow in a Jewish culture at Jerusalem. When the Christian message was delivered to the Gentile world, all the Jewish culture clothes were taken off the gospel at Jerusalem Council, and it was contextualized in a new setting of the Gentile culture. In Acts 17, at the city of Athens, Paul contextualized the gospel of Jesus Christ in the cultural and philosophical views of the Greek. He began to deliver his message by making a bridge from an unknown God to the true and the one God, the living God. In fact, there was no real connections between the unknown God and Jesus Christ, or the God. Paul hardly meant that his audience were unconscious worshippers of the true God, but rather he is drawing their attentions to the true God, who was ultimately responsible for the phenomena which they attributed to an unknown God. Paul used the Greek terms and language in explaining the Hebrew theology. He used cosmos, the world, mentioning God as the creator of cosmos. But in the OT, it was written everything or all things in Jeremiah chapter 10 verse 16. Paul again quoted from their poets and philosophers to reveal the truth of the Bible. Bruce explains that the quotations "for in him we move and live and have our being," verse 28, is taken from the fourth line of Gottring, which was being preserved and attributed to Epimenides of Cretans. The second quotation, "we are his offspring," in verse 28, the quotation from Stoic poet Aratus of Soli in referring to Zeus God, who is considered to be supreme. But Paul does not intend to identify the Greek god Zeus with the God of Israel. He is detaching from their original context sentiment in order to make known the truth about God to them. This does not mean that the Greek sources also carry the same validities and authorities of what the gospel has. Rather, this is only the means to support the truth of the gospel in a way the local people could understand better. According to the New Testament, we can learn that in communicating the gospel, we can contextualize the gospel in the social cultural context of the local people in order to convince the local people about the truth of the gospel in a way they can understand more easily. This is the work of contextualization. Here Paul quoted from the Greek philosophers and poets. But it doesn't mean that Paul equalized the Greek source and the Bible. No. But he just used the Greek source in order to reveal the truth of the Bible to the Greek people. So in this way, we also can use the literature and the sources of our neighbors, the literature and the sources of the people whom we are preaching the gospel to them. We can use their proverbs, their sayings, their philosophies, and their cultural forms, metaphors, in order to convince them the truth of the gospel. We must be very careful we do not equalize the gospel and their culture, but we use their cultural forms in order to convince them the truth of the gospel message. We stop our class here. In the next class, we are going to discuss the principles of contextualizations. Okay, God bless you all.